Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're tackling something absolutely crucial for Rust players. We are breaking down exactly how to customize your Steam launch string to completely eliminate those frustrating stutters and crashes. And we're doing this based entirely on your unique PC hardware. The goal here is pretty straightforward, but man, is it powerful. We literally want to tune the game engine so it runs flawlessly for your specific setup. Look, we've all been there, right? So let's just dive right in by addressing the single biggest mistake players make right out of the gate, blindly copying optimization settings. People constantly hit up a forum or a guide, grab a string of code that worked perfectly for someone else's absolute supercomputer, paste it into their own Steam settings, and then, well, they wonder why their game is still chugging along or just flat out crashing to the desktop. You can't just copy-paste this stuff. You really have to do the math for your own PC. So here's our game plan for today. First, we'll look at the master launch string. Then, we'll dive into system memory math, followed by CPU cores and threads. After that, we'll tackle the critical GPU buffer, and finally, we'll be putting it all together.
All right, let's jump into part 1, the master launch string.
Think of this base template as our foundational blueprint. It contains some static commands that you're just going to leave exactly as they are. Things like -high, which forces the game to run at a high priority, or -window mode exclusive. But our real focus for this explainer is filling in those bracketed variables, specifically for your machine. We're going to go in and replace the RAM, cores, threads, and VRAM placeholders with the exact numbers tailored to your hardware. Moving right along to Section 2, System Memory Math. You know, what's kind of wild here is just how simple the math actually is for determining your maxMem value. Yet, it's incredibly vital for system stability. To tell the game the absolute maximum amount of RAM it can legally address, you just match your total system RAM to these specific values. Please, do not guess this number. If you're still rocking 16 gigabytes, you're going to use 16384. If you have 32 gigabytes, like a lot of modern setups do these days, use 32768. And for the heavy hitters out there with 64 gigabytes, your magic number is 65536.
Okay, on to Section 3, CPU cores and threads.
Don't worry, finding these numbers isn't complicated at all. Literally just takes a few seconds. To optimize how Rust utilizes your processor, you just need to open up your Windows Task Manager, hit that Performance tab, click on your CPU, and look right down there at the bottom right. You're simply grabbing your core count and your logical processors, which, by the way, is just another term for your threads.
And this right here perfectly illustrates how wildly different CPUs actually are, and honestly why copying someone else's string is just a terrible idea. Take the Intel i9-13900K for example. It's an absolute monster of a chip requiring a CPU count of 24 and exThreads of 32. But imagine if you copied that exact string and you're actually running a Ryzen 5 5600X. Your processor only has 6 cores and 12 threads. You'd literally be telling the game engine to look for processing resources that simply do not exist on your computer. Or maybe you have the 5800X3D requiring an 8 and 16 split. You've always got to check your own hardware first.
Let's jump into Section 4, the critical GPU buffer.
This one is a real game changer. This is the setting that manages how often the game clears memory, often referred to as garbage collection. The absolutely crucial point here is aligning your gc.buffer with your graphics card's actual VRAM tier. So if you're lucky enough to have an RTX 4070 with 12 gigabytes of VRAM to spare, you'll set this to 4096. If you're sitting in that 8 to 10 gigabyte mid-range, like maybe an older RTX 3070, you'll want to drop that down to 2048. And if you're playing on an older 6 gigabyte card, you've got to use 1024.
It's literally a Goldilocks situation. Finding this middle ground is essential. Just look at the comparison we have here. If you set it too high, actually, let me rephrase that. If you overestimate your VRAM by setting the buffer too high on a lower-end card, you're going to get immediate out-of-memory crashes. The game is basically trying to use space that isn't there. But on the flip side, underestimating it leads to those incredibly frustrating stutters. Setting the buffer too low on a high VRAM card forces the game to clear out its memory unnecessarily often, which gives you those massive lag spikes right in the middle of a gunfight.
Finally, Section 5. Let's put the whole shebang together.
This final comparison really drives the point home. It perfectly demonstrates the distinct difference between a high-end build that's outputting 120 plus frames per second and a standard mid-range build. It proves exactly why custom values are absolutely mandatory. Just look at that high-end column. 32 gigs of RAM uses 32768. An 8-core CPU uses an 8 and 16 split. And a 12 gigabyte GPU gets that 4096 buffer. But then glance at the mid-range setup next to it. It is completely different. 16 gigs of RAM uses 16384. A 6-core CPU needs a 6 and 12 split, and an 8GB GPU has to use the more conservative 2048 buffer. That's two different PCs and two entirely different optimization blueprints.
So you kind of have to ask yourself, how much performance have you been leaving on the table by running someone else's code? Now that you got the blueprint, it's time to open up your task manager, check your RAM, verify your GPU's VRAM, do the simple math for your own PC, and just let the performance gains speak for themselves. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Now go out there and get those frames.